everyone starts to wonder, well, how the heck did the South Carolina Supreme Court reach a decision that the unborn have essentially no legal protections under the South Carolinian Constitution? Where did those judges come from? And now you start to see, wow, the progressives gamed this 100 years ago, not because they predicted there was going to be an overturning of Roe or any of these central questions, but they constructed the rules of a game that allows them to maximize their favorable outcomes.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Here we are in 2023, some months into it, and it seems like the country's in somewhat bad shape. You know that, of course, the country is in somewhat bad shape, but here we specialize in diagnosing the problem, coming up with solutions, and getting to work. And my guest this week is someone who has been a good friend from afar. I met several years ago now when he was doing something he's not doing now. He'll explain that to you. And now the conservative firebrand Theo Wold, who finds himself in the great state of Idaho, has joined me this week. If you happen not to know Theo, I guarantee you something. You are going to love him by the end of this episode. So with that, Theo, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back to the Imperial City.
Yeah.
Having lived in the Rocky Mountain West, you know, I applaud you for heading out there, but I question your judgment about coming back to D.C. for a few days.
Yeah, even for a few days. I think the funny thing is, you know, I went to school here, undergrad, and
was that Georgetown?
Yeah, and then I spent, you know, obviously time working for Senator Lee, and then in the White House, and this is the first time being back where there isn't the same hold or appeal with the city. I mean, I think you know, when you're young and you're ambitious, and it's the new Rome, right? It's the beating heart of the empire. There's something to be said for being here and figuring out how it works. And this time, coming in from the airport, all I could think about were all the commercial leases that are, you know, obviously empty. You know, downtown is kind of a war zone.
Yeah, it's a real problem when the mayor of Washington, who's not known as very conservative.
Yeah.
It's Lent. I'm searching for the charitable term. Is pressuring the federal government to get their employees back into the office, right? Yeah. It's a real problem for her, all kidding aside.
Well, and it really is one of those examples of you know, how progressive policy leads to this cascade of bad outcomes. Because, I mean, so the commercial, you know, facilities and buildings are largely empty. But all the restaurants are gone. You know, the tailor that I used to go to a couple blocks from the White House, he's closed. The cobblers are all gone. So all those small mom and pop businesses, they got hit by this idea of closing downtown and then going to a remote work policy for the federal government.
So we could spend an episode talking about that with you. And in fact, you and I kind of got to know one another professionally during that time, and we'll talk about that. But we don't want to depress the audience. We know that story.
That's my
right?
specialty.
Yes, I know. And I'm not going to let you do that to us, because I also know inside that realism, it isn't really pessimism, it's realism. And I know that our audience appreciates that, is someone who's willing to fight, which is why I introduced you as a conservative firebrand. So, as is the custom of this show, and certainly my custom as a Southerner, tell us your story. I mean, how in the wide world of sports did you get out to be in Idaho doing some things with the law after having served here in the previous administration?
Yeah, I mean, at some level, I usually say my story is, to paraphrase Lincoln, who was paraphrasing Thomas Gray. It's the short annals of the poor. I grew up in a very poor working class family in one of the poorest regions of the country. I like to say, you know, we're so poor in the Central Valley, we make Appalachia look like Monaco.
People don't appreciate that about that part of California.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you look at any social indices for that region of the country. If it was its own state, it would be the 7th largest state in the union. We would have the fewest college graduates per capita in the entire nation. We have the fewest available hospital beds. We have the highest rates of communicable disease, teenage pregnancies.
Back to the pessimism.
Yeah, well, and I think it, you know, growing up where I did in Stockton, which has always been the first majority minority city in America, and always a very violent place, always struggled with violent crime. I was informed from a very early age about sort of the challenges confronting our republic in a modern age. The depreciation of manufacturing jobs, the struggle of cities that have a vanishing tax base to provide emergency services and law enforcement. So, my childhood, growing up in a working class family, really informed my view on policy and what I wanted to do with my life. So I, studied political philosophy as an undergrad, and I really lucked out. Even at Georgetown, I lucked out in falling in with a good crowd of peers, but also I had some really instrumental mentors, Father James Shaw being one of them in particular. And then, educated mostly by Straussians, and that was also crucial and important. It gave me an appreciation for deep reading and texts, treating ideas seriously. And so from there, struggle with that choice that so many young conservatives have: should I go be an academic, or should I go to law school and do that, like the active life versus the contemplative life kind of dispute. Went to law school. I clerked in the federal district court in Puerto Rico, which was essentially Stockton on an island.
That had to be quite an experience.
It really was. Because I think, if you want to test the vitality of American governance, if you want to see what the application of congressional policymaking looks like, don't go to states, don't go to New York or Miami, go to the insular territories. And there you'll see what the federal government, which essentially has a free hand, you'll see what the federal government is capable of doing in terms of how it can wreck people's opportunities, their upward mobility, but also what it's not doing. And so Puerto Rico, the stories about Puerto Rico's struggles are widely documented financially, socioeconomically, the flight from the island. And so again, a lot of people do district court clerkships or things, and they're in SDNY, or they're at the courthouse in Chicago.
And you're in Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico was robbed at gunpoint multiple times. My judge that I clerked for, a Reagan appointee, very good man. During his career on the bench, he had 7 attempts on his life. Would carry in the courthouse. And so I think you see there both the limits of Article 3. And what it can do. But at the same time, in Puerto Rico, everyone was desperate to get into federal court. You try to find an angle for a slip and fall case to get into federal court. And it was because there was a recognition that the federal courts were above board, that there was a real application of the rule of law, and that you were going to get a fair shake. And I think that is also, a testament to, even in the far-flung territories of America, there is still a functioning notion of the rule of law. So from there, clerked in the D.C. Circuit for Janice Rogers Brown, who was a personal hero.
That had to be a great experience.
Tremendous. Probably the greatest mentor outside of my maternal grandfather on my life. Grew up as sort of like as many young Californians did. I mean, she was the dissenting justice on the California Supreme Court on any number of just instrumental, significant issues, including abortion and the size of government and executive authority of the governor. So clerking for her was a remarkable opportunity, but the D.C. Circuit's a big deal for lawyers and that kind of thing. But for me, it was really the chance to be a student of hers. And from there, worked for Senator Lee on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then ended up in the Trump White House, and still have the PTSD from that. But
we'll talk about that some, but Senator Lee is one of my closest friends in all of Congress, and a longtime close friend of Heritage, and for many of us who are movement conservatives, a hero.
Yeah.
A moniker he would not accept because of his
modesty.
Yeah, that's right. What was it like to work for him?
Again, I mean, tremendous. So the funny story with my job with Senator Lee was, it started essentially as an internship, and they had this posting, and I went to Judge Brown about it, and I said, my colleagues here on the court co-clerks, they're all going to big firms and these really exciting fellowships at DOJ. And I'm thinking about taking this internship. And Judge Brown said to me, Theo, the opportunity to work for a good man who's actually in the arena is infinitesimally rare. She said, when I was first approached by Governor Pete Wilson to take a job in his administration, but not for me. I liked what I was doing, and I had a good job and a good trajectory, and then I got to sit down with Governor Wilson and take the measure of the man, and I knew that this was someone who had principle, who had real honor, and it wouldn't just be fun working for him, but that it would be important and meaningful work. And so she said, look, it may not pay much and it may not be prestigious, but this is something you should probably do. And she was right. I mean, Senator Lee has not only been a mentor of mine and like a great patron, I would say, but he's a man who, because of his personal virtue, is able to wrestle with hard questions and disagree with his own party and also obviously his Democrat colleagues. And this is often, I'm sure you hear this all the time, be disagreeable without, being personally disagreeable, but to maintain that civility. And I think that's because he's moored in some real meaningful principles that are not part of the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, and it's just impossible or almost impossible for anyone to malign him.
Yeah.
I mean, some people do because that's kind of where the radical left has gone, but it doesn't change his approach.
No.
And it also doesn't make him less conservative.
No, it doesn't make him less conservative. And I think, someone once said to me, like, well, you're like birds of a feather with Senator Lee, like, these like egghead, you want to really think about the ideas. And I think that's it's an unfair caricature of Senator Lee because he does have an immense intellect and he is very thoughtful, but push him and he will fight back, and push him and you will not move him from his principled position. And that's something I growing up in the neighborhood I did and around the men that raised me, my maternal grandfather, my dad, they were all working class men who worked with their hands. And the joke in my family was always, well, the kinds of scars that Theo's going to get on his hands are going to come from paper cuts, not swinging a hammer or something. And I think for me, Senator Lee was important because he was one of the first men I met who is a man and convicted about his virtue and, his principles, but he's not ashamed of being an intellect. He's not ashamed of being rigorous and thinking through hard problems or, making what some people would call esoteric or heady arguments. Not ashamed of that at all. And I think that's not just an important niche for him, but I think that's an important facet of any Republican government, to have people who are willing to make arguments that are not going to be easily translatable into 24-hour news cycle sound bites.
Yeah, and he's really become not just the conscience of the Senate, but for us at Heritage, often referred to as the leading intellectual voice in the policy space, the conscience of the movement.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure there's anything I disagree with Senator Lee on, at least in any significant way.
Yeah.
There might be some marginal differences of opinion. I know I
Yeah.
can speak for everyone at Heritage, including our wonderful folks in the Me Center about that, our legal center. It's just he's always open to the conversation. And so I imagine in some weird, ironic way, that was good preparation for going into the Trump administration. So tell us about that. That's where you and I met.
Yeah. It was in a way, right? Because I think I often tell young people, don't spend the best part of your youth on the Hill. I mean, it's a good proving ground, but you should not look at it as a career. You should look at it as a game that you've got to figure out how to play. Learn the rules and test theories and then get out of there and do something where you can manifest that skill set.
Every game comes to an end and you can win games.
Yeah.
You don't have to lose them.
That's right. So that year on the Hill, it was important to have, a principled figure a mentor like Senator Lee, but also learn how the Hill works, and I think appropriately calibrate my expectations for what is possible for Congress to accomplish.
which means to lower them?
Yes.
Decisively.
I think the irony there is also that there was whiplash, right? You go from this Latter-day Saint, nice, civil, courteous office to what was essentially trench warfare, where your own colleagues are trying to kill you off, either because you had an idea that they didn't, you got into the Oval when they couldn't, and so the dysfunction, the personality dysfunction of a White House, which I argue, read your accounts going back to the Carter administration or earlier. It's been there for most of the modern presidencies. It's just in part attributable to the arrangement of power.
It's become a feature of that power, right?
Yes, and arguably also the disorder that's common in most of us in modern American secular life. That was shocking. Because you went from sort of like the Lee world, where everyone was committed to sort of the vision of principled, smart governance, to it's a free for all, and not everyone here is actually committed to the same agenda, let alone the president's agenda. As I said, trench warfare, but I enjoyed the White House. I mean, I think it changed me. I think I was telling a group of high school kids the other day, it's Frodo's not the same, even though he destroys the ring, right? It leaves a psychic scar, if you will. I think that was true of my time from the White House. But I think we did important work. I think we accomplished a great deal of good for the country, and I still remain one of those who would argue that President Trump is a unique figure. Never once heard President Trump say, show me the polling on this, or let's message test that with a focus group first. And I think that's a unique feature.
For whatever someone may say about him, he's a real leader.
Yeah. Yes.
And we need more of that in
That's
America.
Right. Decisiveness, and the ability in that way that's unique to figures like him. I mean, the man has a high EQ. He's very capable of producing loyalty and understanding the motivations or intentions of people who are either working for him or people who want to do a deal with him. And I think that's a necessary trait of good leadership.
So what was your role in the Trump White House?
So I started as a special assistant to the president for domestic policy, and I was kind of on a Lend-Lease program, if you will, between
the historian in me really appreciates that reference, Theo.
Yeah. Between Brimberg on DPC and Stephen Miller, and I started working out on immigration policy. And then I finished my time in the White House as the deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy. And in between had worked in the Office for American Innovation and for Jared Kushner, and then ended the time in the administration the last couple of months over at DOJ as the acting assistant attorney general in the Office of Legal Policy. So,
and what would you say? You have to check your modesty. What was the achievements of the Trump administration that you had a big role in that you're most proud of?
I mean, the one that I'm most proud of was the effort to reinstate the Tennessee Valley Authority workers in their jobs. And you'll have to forgive me because this is essentially a progressive talking point, but in that sense, politics is personal. These were, hardworking Americans who played by the rules. They did what they were told. Go and get an education, study STEM, and you'll get programmer or engineer or IT jobs. You can be a manager at an entity that you and I would both agree should not exist. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a creation of President Roosevelt. It's an autonomous agency that's also a corporation. Figure that one out.
And yet, to your earlier reference, that is the game.
Yeah.
And these good people are trying to play the rules of that game.
Yeah, and moreover, the intention in creating that agency was to provide economic opportunity to one of the most dispossessed regions of the country for Americans. And so when the Tennessee Valley Authority announced that they were going to fire these Americans and replace them with H-1B visa holders from abroad, and throw in there the wrinkle that this agency produces electricity for 8 southeastern American states, including 2 nuclear power plants. So there was, some real concerns about who these foreign nationals would be and what they would be doing. For me, it reminded me of all the number of times I saw my father laid off and replaced by foreign labor that was cheaper, that didn't have to comply with California state regulations or licensing requirements. And there was a fairness question there, but it was also, I think, at some level, a question of rectitude. We campaigned on fighting for these kinds of people, and now this is squarely in our wheelhouse. Any concerns people may have about intervening in the private market, the free market, as with Disney workers or AT&T, that's not here. These are government employees. So we came up with the idea that the president should fire members of the board until they relented. And don't want to belabor the complicated legal questions here, but the CEO of the Tennessee Valley Authority is insulated from removal authority of the president, but the board wasn't. And essentially, constructing kind of a diehard terrorist scenario. We're going to let go of one of these board members every hour until you reinstate these workers.
I love the approach.
Yeah. And then, the thing is, a lot of consternation internally. And that was one of those moments where you realize you're on a trapeze and you don't have a net below you. I was told by a number of senior figures in the White House, if this goes south, if we're challenged legally on these dismissals, if one of these workers shows up and says something that's discordant or criticizes the president in front of the cameras, that's on you. And, you do a gut check and, wow, this could be bad. But it's worth it because this is who we said we were coming to fight for. And we got the workers their jobs back. And, it made for a nice, talking point for the comms people and all that. So delivered something for people that they could, communicate to the American people. But for me, it was in meeting these workers, mostly from Tennessee. These were the people who raised me. And being able to one-to-one, this was the wrong, and we fixed the wrong. That was deeply rewarding.
Yeah, and delivering on a promise is something that those people and unfortunately most Americans don't expect the government to do anymore.
No,
and it seems as if that's one of the things that we have to fix. And so, just to not only continue this narrative thread of what has motivated you to do what you're doing. And the reason I'm drawing that out is because I find it interesting and I'm the host of the show, but also because I know a lot of the people who watch or listen to this show are contemplating this ask that I make, that a lot of people are making now, which is whenever conservatives get a chance to be in power again in the executive branch in DC, we need thousands of good people to come here. They don't need to expect to stay 10 years, 30 years. I often phrase it as tithing to your republic.
Yeah.
And then go back to whatever home is, or in your case, go find a new home. In your case, it's Idaho. But what have you taken from your DC experience to not just work in Idaho, but life in Idaho? Because one of the things we're trying to conserve isn't really just regular order in government, as important as that is, but all the best parts of living life well.
Yeah. I mean, this was a conversation you and I had years ago. I was, quite taken by your insight at the time that the people who run the empire here in DC, they really need to spend more time out of DC. And not in the gimmick way, not this idea of like, we'll move this agency to Omaha and this bureaucracy to Denver, and that way DC won't exist anymore. No, you've just moved things around on the playing field. Get out of DC and see the consequences of even conservative policy, even malformed or poorly thought through conservative policy, and see the burdens that it has imposed on, in particular, working families, but the people of this country. So I think for my wife and I, our motivation in part in getting out of DC, the summer of love was bad in this city. And I think for even despite the concentration of law enforcement in DC, it was very clear to us that if things went bad, there wouldn't be anyone coming to help us out. And
it's not an exaggeration.
No. And you go to a place, like Eagle, Idaho, or Meridian, Idaho, and right away you see there is still an America in America. When people ask me, well, what's Idaho like? I say it's the most American place I've ever lived. Neighbors actually not only learn your name,
and they want to.
Yeah, they genuinely want to, but they actually give a dang about what you're doing, what you care about, what your plans are. That connective tissue that used to be common, what the left will always call community. It actually exists. There is a pride and a commitment still to the traditions and rituals that are central to, I think, Republican citizenship. Not just the ones that we do at a ball game, like singing the anthem, but
these are really human relationships,
deeply human and deeply humane in cultivating a certain, not just civility, but like that sort of civic religion that Lincoln saw as so important, so central to the American psyche. That still exists, and look, it's under siege, and it's challenged by the predominant sort of media entertainment complex. It's a deluge of secularism and progressive ideology, but it's still there. So I think the thing I learned from DC, now being in the hinterlands in one of the far-flung provinces, it's really important for especially the young folks coming up in the conservative movement. You've got to develop a real skill set, because my grandfather used to say it's really important that you be of some use. And in his mind, being of use was obviously you either have a skilled trade, or you're a lawyer, or you're a doctor, or you're an engineer. You build stuff, you help people.
It's timeless advice, really.
Yeah. And I think a lot of DC is fake. It's fake. It's skill sets that will never really actually matter in the contests and the confrontations that will be central to saving the republic. So, give you an example. I'll say often to young people, stop, who work on the Hill, stop calling ledge services to write your bills. Learn to write statutory text. And you'll do it poorly, especially if you have only a passing familiarity with the law. But here's the thing. There are thousands of statutes on the books that you can study. Some of them good, some of them bad. So your model is there. All you have to do is apply yourself and start to figure out how that works. You go to a red state capital like Boise, and there's a real need. They don't have a full-time legislature. The members of the legislature don't even have staff. So, they're reading bills, they're amending them, they're writing their own, all in sequence on a short-term 3-month session. You arrive in a place like that, and you say, I can help you write text to ban drag shows. I can help you write statutory text that would enable local law enforcement to work in concert with federal immigration authorities. I don't know everything about that issue, but I know how to draft a statute. That's a real skill. That's a real ability that will have direct application and can be of immense assistance.
And I'll just underscore that, pardon the brief interjection, that I didn't know anything about the importance of that when I left Wyoming Catholic College and went to Texas Public Policy Foundation. I knew about the ideas and the policy, and put the right people in the right spot and then give them the power to go do their thing and the relational side of visiting with legislators. But the point is, about 3 months into the first session that where I was leading TPPF through that, I realized, oh my gosh, we have so few people, especially on our side, who can draft bill text. And I know some people listening or watching this say, well, listening to or watching this are saying this is kind of esoteric. It's where the rubber meets the road in state legislative sessions, for that matter, in city council meetings, because you got to draft the ordinances, and certainly at the federal level. And here at Heritage, we deeply prize those colleagues who are really good drafters of bill text. And even we don't have a whole lot of them. And I just know that if the conservative movement is going to succeed, people will take your advice and they'll do it. And just like with any new skill, whether it's a sport or something intellectual, something professional, you're not going to be good at it at first.
No.
But we need more people to be willing to do it, because those are the game-changing kinds of skills that the movement needs to succeed.
I think that's right. And again, I think, I'm part of our move obviously was for our children, so they could grow up in some semblance of an America, right? Because I hear stories about what California was like, what Michigan was like. But I didn't grow up in that reality. So part of it was that, but part of it was also a commitment to the idea that red states, this whole theory of federalism, of them being, the incubators of, or, laboratories of democracy, that's a meaningless canard. That is a trite cliche if red state legislatures and red state governors don't have the resources to push what we would think would constitute red state policy. What's on shelf for them? It's what the lobbyists cook up, or the regional subsidiaries of national lobbying groups, or think tanks that not always have the purest of intentions. So learning and developing these skills, this is a real opportunity for even the youngest, most inexperienced Hill staffer to develop a real niche and then go home. And as Judge Brown says, she has a great speech she gave a couple years ago about repointing a brick wall. That a skilled mason can build a beautiful thing, right? In putting together bricks and mortar, but even the strongest, most beautiful brick wall has to have the mortar resurfaced and what the technical term in masonry, repointed. And part of our project, it's different at the federal government here in DC, but part of our project in red states is repointing those walls and strengthening the sort of defensive arrangements against the onslaught of the modern progressive left.
So if we do that, I want to be sure that we talk a little bit about policy, given the depth with which you can do that before we wrap. Although we'll have you back plenty of times over the years if you're willing. What are the issues? What are the, say, top 2 or 3 issues, either at the state level or the federal level, that constitute repointing the wall well?
Yeah, and look, I'm going to bore a lot of your audience, but
I doubt it.
This is, sometimes people will say this is a bit esoteric, but for me right now, they are what I call structural reforms. And it is shocking the level of destruction that was wreaked by the early progressives to state constitutions, and to the arrangement of state governmental powers. And then that was doubled down on in the 1970s. And look, as much as we may talk about a Reagan revolution or the 94 revolution, and whether that had any salience, lasting impact in DC or not, what is true in state governments, we are essentially living in the progressives' world. They designed the selection of court officials. They designed balloting, and the way elections are conducted. They designed what prerogatives the bureaucracy has contra a governor, and what authorities the governor has to either minimize or eliminate the bureaucracy. You want to talk about deep state. I mean, there are no more entrenched deep state actors. They're not as sophisticated, and they don't have the same resources, and there's no intel apparatus that they can rely on. Their intel apparatus is probably FBI and Maine Justice here in DC, but state bureaucracies are almost more entrenched than what we see in the federal government. So for me right now, I would say one of the biggest policy areas is you've got to get these building block issues right. And the blueprint is easy. So take, for example, the selection of judges. The way it works in so many red states, the progressives designed what was essentially called the Missouri Plan, which allowed trial lawyers and legal experts, academics from the academies that the left captured 20, 30, 40 years ago, to populate lists of names of who counts as a suitable potential nominee to the courts. And a governor doesn't get to just pick a name. He has to go to he's bound by the list that's populated by these external interests that are not accountable in any way to the people. In fact, in many instances, the people aren't even aware of where their trial judges come from. And then the governor has to pick a name from this list, and that's usually the process. There's no political vote. There's no confirmation vote from a Senate. All insulated from the review of the people. And this is the game that the progressives played, right? Which was to say, we want enhanced direct democracy. It's always, whether it's the political primary system, that's direct democracy. Selection of senators, direct democracy. Same on the courts. We want direct democracy in the states, so we should have trial lawyers, members of the bar. They should pick our judges for them. Where our framers would have said, the governor is accountable to the people, just like the chief executive here in D.C. He's a political actor, and whoever he chooses as his nominee is in part a political calculus. And if you don't like it, that's something you can hang over his head when he runs for re-election.
Change it.
Change it.
At least you have the opportunity to change it.
And then a confirmation vote shows you whether or not the people's representatives in the legislature, or at least one chamber of the legislature, give their assent to the governor's choice. Checks and balances, if you will. The fact that we are so far removed from that reality, and we don't even stop to think about that. And some of your listeners may say, well, what the heck does this have to do with anything? Well, now in a post-Dobbs world, everyone starts to wonder, well, how the heck did the South Carolina Supreme Court reach a decision that the unborn have essentially no legal protections under the South Carolinian Constitution? Where did those judges come from? And now you start to see, wow, the progressives gamed this 100 years ago, not because they predicted there was going to be an overturning of Roe or any of these central questions, but they constructed the rules of a game that allows them to maximize their favorable outcomes. So I think building block issues, another one that's really important to me that a number of fellows here at Heritage have written very persuasively about is defending one man, one vote and eliminating, passing prohibitions against ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, it's offered as direct democracy.
It sounds so sweet.
Yeah. You'll end up with some choice that the public can live with. It's a complicated, confusing system. It gives even more authority to the nameless, faceless bureaucrats who count ballots under the cover of secrecy or darkness. And the states that have adopted these systems, or the jurisdictions that have, obviously they're all far left progressive jurisdictions, and the outcomes have been abysmal. There have been actual races under ranked choice voting that have had to be entirely rerun because the counting was inaccurate, but only after outside third-party organizations notified the city of Oakland, for example, that they had counted a school board race wrong. That's a building block issue. It's not an education savings account. It's not about the drag show prohibitions, but all of those prohibitions or those policy enactments won't matter if progressives can run the table in elections, if they can run the table on judicial selection.
And that's precisely what they're trying to do. And thankfully, a growing number of conservatives, whether they're policymakers or friends of heritage, people who follow your work, have become wise to that.
Yeah.
And the optimist in me says, and I don't mean this with any kind of hollow optimism, that we're on the brink of turning the corner on that, but that isn't to say that there isn't a whole lot of hard work ahead, because the funding on ranked choice voting, as an example, is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
And I know we've had a hand in making that dead on arrival in a couple of states, but that's just a couple of states.
Yeah.
It's marching forward in several.
Yes, I mean, and you're right. Look, I mean, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, they raised $15.5 million because they know what's at stake. Ranked choice voting, Eric Holder and his organization. I know this is always like the conspiracy theory thing with the Soros Open Society.
But it's true.
And voting for fairness. They're all in favor of ranked choice voting. They have high-level surrogates from Hollywood and Senator Warren. They cut ads and they do campaigning all over the country to implement ranked choice voting. And I think our side, obviously we have to cultivate the arguments for why it's bad, why this is wrong, why it will be deleterious to the full effect of your vote. But then we've actually got to go out there and fight it. We have to train activists and citizens to inform the legislators to fight back.
We must. So last policy question before the final question, which has something to do about optimism, by the way, just to give you a heads up, to sort of get through your inner realism and think about something hopeful. Policy question is it's 4 years from now. No, 2 years from now. It's 2025. There's a conservative president, whoever he or she is, like a real conservative who's elected with a very ambitious, aspirational vision, and conservatives control both chambers of Congress. What does winning look like on the policy side?
Yeah, great question. I think in part, and this is inside baseball stuff again, but in part, a Republican president, if there is one in January of 2025, has to be committed to taking on the deep state in a meaningful way. And the expectation from many Americans will be, are my streets safer? Did you cut my taxes? Are you going to fix this problem with the ideology that's targeting my children? But again, none of that's possible so long as the chief executive who sits in the Oval Office can only govern by the fickle whim of the deep state. And the options that exist right now for a Republican president is full-on capitulation, a negotiated compromise. I'll govern in this area here, and you get everything else, deep state, and we'll just agree to leave each other alone. Or I can only impose my will as the elected executive. The people chose me. I can only express their will and govern accordingly if I deal with you first. And so I think winning looks like structural statutory reform of a lot of the administrative state, reining in the abuses of the intel state, which may include jettisoning most of what was enacted post 9/11 with 702 and the surveillance state. And reanimating what I would call Republican citizenship, small r, and Republican governance, which is we've had it with the experts. We're not going to be governed by public health officials, food scientists. There are lots of problems potentially that can only be solved by intellectuals with advanced degrees and credentials that are arm's length long. But maybe those problems will just have to wait. Maybe they're not the province of government, because for the sake of transparency, for accountability, and for really getting at the heart. I mean, because conservatives have said this for so long, and it's almost a phrase that means nothing now. Limited government, smaller government, shrink government. That's all meaningless if the small government you still have means a government ruled and controlled by Anthony Fauci's. If it's only government by expert, I have a PhD and I know better than you do. Your common sense be damned. Then I would rather have a Leviathan. At least then that antagonizes the citizenry, and we can all find that to be abhorrent. So I think winning looks like restoring the notion that the people have the wisdom, they have the lived experience, they have the capacity to govern themselves. And I would love it. Just as a plug for the issue set near and dear to my heart, I would love it if Congress actually cleaned up the Immigration Naturalization Act and made American citizens, put American citizens not just economically at the front, in terms of opportunities and the like, but also once again made clear that citizenship for naturalized Americans or Americans born here, citizenship means something. And there are privileges that come with citizenship that are important but also exclusive to citizens. And that can only be done if Congress takes that seriously and really does some real work on the INA and some joint provisions there.
Well, as you know, Heritage is with you enthusiastically on that reform. We can perhaps look forward to that day. So last question, Theo, is in your most optimistic moments. Do you have those?
Yeah, now and then. Yeah. So I've got small kids, so I have to be optimistic.
You have to be. So now that we've established you do have these thoughts, so this is not hollow optimism. What constitutes your hopefulness? What is it? Is it policy? Is it life? Is it something just kind of amorphous, but just a feeling that America is going to get it right? I'm curious because I know you're one of the great realists I know. So when I need someone to rain on a parade, and I actually mean this as a compliment because I'm such an eternal optimist. I have to be sure I have friends who say, Kevin, you got to check a little bit of that. You're not gonna win on that one. But you have moments where you say, I think we're going to do it. Why?
So I guess I've never really thought about that. Multifaceted answer. It's a question of faith.
Sure.
At base. It's also a question of justice. We have better ideas. When I had my conversion to conservatism, I grew up in a Union Democrat house, and when I became what I am now, I was convinced in part we are more virtuous people on our side in our movement. I know that's not true now. We have plenty of vice and moral incontinence, but I think our ideas are better, and there is more of a purity of intention. We want people to live healthy, productive, good, fertile lives. We want people to be free, to enjoy their children, and to do those humane things that we talked about earlier, to form a family, to raise children. And so, at some level, my most hopeful is, and this may be discordant to some of your listeners, but America is in many ways, we used to say like the full flowering of Western civilization, right? We're the greatest country in the history of the world, and we can debate and argue where that's true and where it's not. But it's certainly the case that we may be the last exponents of Western civilization. And at that, when you're standing on the Acropolis or in Jerusalem looking through the epochs of Western civilization, we owe it to this edifice to do our damnedest to defend it and to preserve it. So I think multifaceted, it's a sense of justice. It's a sense of a faith, obviously, and in a primordial way, it's a commitment to our ancestors.
It strikes me as a really helpful response, by the way. It's interesting over the year of doing the show, the different answers that people give, but they all kind of come back to the same thing. You've worded it in a particularly eloquent way, I will say, which is essentially honoring our cultural inheritance, even if we're skeptical, perhaps even have our pessimistic moments about our ability to conserve that cultural inheritance. What you're saying is, as a matter of justice, not just professionally, but as a dad, as a husband, you're going to go fight for it. And I think that's the answer. And having the privilege myself of traveling the country each month, often each week, and meeting everyday Americans, like the people that you and I grew up with, raised us, we are.
Yeah.
I know that we're going to do it. It's just the question is, can we summon the perseverance for the number of battles ahead to take back the country? That's really the question. The question, to your point, isn't whether we're going to battle. The question is, can we have the fortitude to sustain the fight?
I think that's right. And I guess the hopeful answer, the wellspring of hope in that instance is, men and women like my father who did actual hard and do today. My father is passed, but who do hard work every day for very little pay. Their names are never going to show up in the newspaper or on TV. And that kind of perseverance, that kind of commitment, to some, in the instance of my father, who never got to see the fruits of his labors, didn't get to see the kinds of cool things I did in the White House or any of that stuff, or meet his grandchildren. So who work and labor anonymously for a future they may never know. And so, look, if the guy can do that in the mine up in North Idaho, or my father on, job sites, construction sites all throughout, 114-degree weather in California, yeah, I think I can learn how to write a statute.
Paper cuts are worth it.
Yeah.
Theo Wold, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, you're a great American. We look forward to having you back.
Appreciate that.
Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Theo Wold as much as I did. As I told you, you would love him by the end of the episode. I know that that's true. You can keep tabs on him by just following Idaho politics. And of course, at some point when the bell rings, we know that he'll be ready for the next fight. Thank you for making this show possible. If you've not yet done so, please give us a rating. And the one socialist comment you'll hear me say is we only want 5-star ratings. No, you rate it however you would like. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.